Hello, this is Jamie Mitchell, and we are back in another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. First, we have the Senate Agricultural Committee is expected to review the Farm Bill at the end of June. Make sure you contact your representatives now and tell them to keep the SOB Act out of the Farm Bill before your state loses its voice on food standards permanently. And that's a Facebook post from, looks like Anna Connolly is cool, and that was posted by Mundane Image 13, and they added, here's a good explanation on the issues around the SOB Act. Our government should be protecting us from corporations and not doing what Big Corp wants. Big Corp does not care about us and will do whatever they deem they can get away with while making billions of dollars. But even if you don't care about that part, basically it's more big government stamping on states' rights. And yeah, I personally would agree with, that. I think the libertarian position is you shouldn't have any farm bill. If the government wants to give farmers bailout money, they can justify throwing money wherever they want to. But ultimately, I think the libertarian position is, each farm needs to operate on its own rather than rely on government assistance because, when the more government assistance they rely on, the more control the government has over them. And I think that's very important to remember. And I definitely do think, we should be focusing on states' rights over the rights of the federal government, and we need to decentralize the power as much as possible, and that definitely includes all overreaching federal bills such as the Farm Bill. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Supreme Court sides of Texas man who challenged law barring drug users from having guns from CBSNews.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I think libertarian positions, if you should be able to have whatever drugs and guns you want to, as long as you're not hurting anyone else. And ultimately that's very much the libertarian position. Do whatever you want with whatever you want, as long as you're not hurting anyone else. And that's my thoughts there. Next, we have clips are going viral of the new $14 million paint on the reflecting pool peeling off just 12 days after the pool reopened, posted by Ragnarok KXG, and that's cross-post from the Progressive HQ subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but ultimately, I think, it's just this is kind of WWE politics right here. Same with Trump putting his name on the Kennedy Center. No one really cares too much about the reflecting pool and other, it's just kind of the current thing. And yeah, it's just kind of a distraction from the Iran war and the Epstein files and all that. And that's very much what politics is. It's all kind of distractions. Politics isn't real. It's all just kind of a psyop to distract people from the fact that both branches of the Uniparty are complicit in screwing over the American people as much as possible. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump administration quietly shifts $352 million in federal funds for White House ballroom from TheGuardian.com, posted by Donald Key. And yeah, this is another WWE thing, the White House ballroom. Anytime the stories about Washington D.C., what government structures in Washington D.C., it's usually probably just a distraction. I personally don't think we should be spending $352 million in federal funds for the White House ballroom, but ultimately, they can throw federal money at whatever they want to, and oftentimes, there's nothing you can do about it. It's just kind of a distraction, though, same for pretty much everything involving government buildings in Washington, D.C., they probably got touched up a bunch under Obama, Biden, and all the previous presidents, but Reddit only seems scared that Trump's doing anything to them. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump has purchased stakes in dozens of companies. Congress is about to clear the way for more from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't think Trump should be doing that as the president. But, ultimately, he's going to act in his own self-interest. And that's true of whoever's in the government. And I personally think the libertarian position is we shouldn't have. It's a good reason why we shouldn't have a forced collectivist government, because ultimately anyone in a position of state power is going to act in their own self-interest. And then when they're in a position of state power, you shouldn't be acting in your own self-interest. But ultimately, everyone pretty much is, and that's why we shouldn't be forced to obey whatever the government says, since they're going to be selfish people just like every other person, and I think that's important to remember. Next, we have PT, 100 Years of Rothbard. Hans Hermann Hoppe and others will be featured on the 100-year anniversary of Rothbard's birth, celebrated at the 27th of June in Oporto, Portugal, from Rothbard 100.pt, posted by Amugus Devilman, and that's a cross post from the Team Liberal subreddit, and it looks like it's the same post but in Portuguese. And yeah, personally, I think Rothbard and Hans Hermann Hoppe are probably some of the better libertarian voices. They're too edgy for a lot of normies, but I definitely do think, they're definitely some of the better libertarian voices out there, especially like Hans Hermann Hoppe's, thesis that democracy has failed. And because I very much do think that democracy is naturally mob rule and tyranny of the majority, and you shouldn't be supporting it because it's just gonna just because the majority of the population thinks something doesn't necessarily make it right. If the majority of the population wants to send someone to jail for no reason at all, that doesn't make it right. And ultimately, I think libertarian positions, you gotta focus on individual liberties and freedoms rather than force collectivist democracy, in which the majority can force its will on the minority just by checking off a box on a piece of paper. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Cuba's Communist Party approves emergency economic plan opening to private enterprise from apnews.com, posted by socialist or morons. And I think that's good. Ultimately, it just goes to show you that communism doesn't work. And look at China, which is still communist in name, but is really very much open to private enterprises. The same with Cuba, which it seems to do going that same route. Ultimately, I think libertarian positions, if people want to do communism amongst themselves, they should be able to. They shouldn't be forcing communism on other people without their consent. Ultimately, each individual should be choosing whatever system they want to do best. If they want to do communism and do communism of other people who are voluntarily consenting, I think that's fine. But I don't think people should be forced to do communism if they don't want to. It's the same with capitalism. You're not forced to participate in a capitalist society, despite what some Reddit communists might want you to think. You're always free to live out in a cabin in the woods and not participate in the capitalist society. I think that's important to remember as well. Next, we have The Impossibility of Reversal, Why Capital Punishment Fails the Test of Accountability, from Cato.org, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian positions, capital punishment should at the very most shouldn't exist, because you can't just kill people even if they have violated the NAP. Ultimately, I think at the very least it should be voluntary. And yeah, personally, I think if it's involuntary, I think that's fine. But ultimately, I do think life in prison is probably the better option. But you could make the argument that you still have to feed those guys as well, and even the cheapest food still costs money. But so ultimately, I think ultimately it's whatever the state wants to decide. Sometimes if you can kill a guy fast enough using capital punishment, maybe that could save you money. But ultimately, they're just going to sit on death row for years, and I don't think it's worth the cost of it. But ultimately, the state's going to justify choosing whatever it wants to. And I personally don't think the state should be killing people even if they have violated the NAP. But ultimately, the state's in a position where it can justify whatever it wants to justify. And oftentimes, there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have Trump's $14 million reflecting pool paint job is now peeling off and floating to the surface, from HuffPost.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, as I said earlier, I don't really care for that. But this is just a distraction, no one cared about the reflecting pool until Trump skimped on it. But now it's suddenly the most important thing. Eventually it's going to be something else. That's very much how social media works. It's always whatever the current thing is. Next, we have 4chan's lawyer says the UK government doesn't understand the internet and has given Ofcom an impossible task by trying to enforce British online safety rules on US-based platforms. Preston Byrne, who represents 4chan, argued that the site is protected by the First Amendment, from X.com, posted by Economy Medicine Free 18, and that's a X post from Pirate Nation. And yeah, personally, I think The libertarian position is you need freedom of the internet. I know a lot of woke libertarians don't like 4chan and wish it was censored, but ultimately the libertarian position is you should have as free an internet as possible. If that being said, ultimately the UK government's in a position where they can ban whatever website they want, and there's nothing you can do about it really. But it just goes to show you that the same people who are bitching about China and its censorship with the Great Firewall, a lot of them are the same people who are supportive of a 4chan ban. I think that's important to remember as well. I don't think that you should be banning any websites, but ultimately when you're in a position of government authority, you can probably block any websites you want to, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. It's very much how the state is in a position of controlling the internet, just like it can control anything else within its borders, and that's not personally something I care for, but it's ultimately something they have the legal monopoly on the use of the law and force to do. Next, we have U.S. House lawmakers. Israeli National Defense Authorization Act, NDAA, provision section 219 faces bipartisan blowback from military.com, posted by Apollo Delphi, and that's cross-post from the Live News 24H subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't care for section 219 and how they want to merge the U.S. and Israeli militaries, but the U.S. and Israel's already so far up Israel's ass, I personally don't think it would change that much. But yeah, personally, I think we gotta keep the U.S. independent of Israel. But sadly, the Israel lobby is just so powerful when it comes to the U.S. government. It's kind of going to be a losing battle. Next, we have Senate NDAA would give the Pentagon Equal Equity Portfolio from Cato.org, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't think the Pentagon should have an equity portfolio, but ultimately the government's in a position of authority to justify whatever they feel, what bullshit they feel like. And yeah, that's just sadly how the world works. Next, we have 2/3 of the defensive weapons that protected you have been built by American hands and paid for by American dollars. J.D. Vance, posted by Rabat Ascalon, and that's a cross post from the Global News subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for. I don't know who he's speaking to there. If he's talking to Israel, I don't think the U.S. should be sending all its weapons to Israel, but ultimately, I do think the libertarian position is, people should be crafting. Let's see, they do have a description. U.S. President J.D. Vance left out members of the Israeli government response to their criticism of President Trump over the Iran during White House news briefing. So yeah, personally, I don't think the U.S. should be giving all its defensive weapons to Israel, but ultimately, if the U.S. government wants to give all its defensive weapons to Israel, there's nothing you can do about it. The Israel lobby is one of the most powerful lobbies in the city, chock full of them, and I think that's important to remember as well. Next, we have Donald Trump says there are low limits to his power after Iran war from thehill.com, posted by LegioX. And yeah, this is just Donald Trump trying to jerk himself off again. When he does it the first time, it's okay to be surprised. But when he does it for the 10,000th time, eventually it's just another day. And ultimately, I don't really care for how much Donald Trump tries to jerk himself off. But you can't take his bait every single time. If you want to, like Reddit does, you can. But eventually, you just kind of move on and just think it's Trump's usual gusto. And that's my thoughts there. Next, we have Celebrating American Freedom means celebrating Juneteenth from Reason.com, posted by Jaya Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is if you want to celebrate Juneteenth, you should be able to. But ultimately, you shouldn't be forced to celebrate any holiday you don't want to. If you want to celebrate Juneteenth, you should be able to. If you want to celebrate Garfield the cat's birthday, which is on the same day, you should be able to. If you don't celebrate any holiday, you should be able to. Celebrate or don't celebrate whatever holidays you want to. Next, we have ICE largely abandons plan to turn warehouses into migrant detention facilities from Reason.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for them using warehouses as migrant detention facilities, but ultimately, if they want to start using them as that, they're in a position of authority to do so. Next, we have I Agree You're Crazy, posted by Nietzsche, and that looks like a screenshot from the Work Life Cat subreddit, Crazy, and this looks like a screenshot of a tweet from Jack Red Flag, who tweeted, "It's absolutely wild that people can just work 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, for 50-odd years and not realize there's something deeply fucking wrong with it." And the OP added, "Please just give me things mommy government real easy in today's world with the fascistic tendencies we see in the demonstration on the right, figure out how fucking backshit the left can really be. Absolutely wild. Edit, since the question has always arisen about the intention of the post screenshot, I implore you to the comment section of the post for context." And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, see, you do have to work in life if you want to control your own resources. If you don't want to work, just by doing whatever you want to. But ultimately, when you're dependent on the state, that's not very libertarian. You should try and be as self-sufficient as possible, and I think that's very much the libertarian position. Next, we have Social Security's $5.1 trillion debt contribution from Cato.org, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I think libertarian position is you gotta get rid of Social Security and other government entitlement spending. But ultimately, the U.S. government a lot of the U.S. population are too dependent on Social Security to ever want it gone. Same with a lot of other welfare, and that's why I personally think it's the welfare and the size of government are only going to increase over time. And sadly, there's nothing you can do about it. I personally do think welfare spending, it's not the worst thing the government spends money on. That would probably be endless foreign aid and bombs for other country and that bombs to use on other countries. But ultimately, I definitely do think we shouldn't be throwing all this money around willy nilly. A lot of people are bitching about Elon Musk becoming the world's first trillionaire, yet they're completely fine with the U.S. government having what is essentially a $5.1 trillion Ponzi scheme in Social Security, and that's something that's very important to remember. If the government wants to throw all this money at Social Security, they should be able to. But I personally make libertarian positions, if people want to voluntarily pay for Social Security, they should be able to, but they shouldn't be forced to pay for it if they don't want to. And that's my program for a lot of government welfare. People are forced to pay for it, even though they might not want to. And that's my thoughts on that issue. So I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.